what we've seen is well-intentioned marketers and brands lean into inclusivity, but do so in a way where we see some incremental change, but really no major shifts in how inclusivity is practiced in the industry. And so we see in some ways greater inclusivity, but we are at a kind of crossroads, as I see it in marketing, where we have stalled in a way by focusing on this superficial kind of inclusivity.
Hey, what's up, branding experts? Arek here, and welcome to On Branding Podcast. And today, my guest is Dr. Anastasia Kārkliņa Gabriel. And Dr. Gabriel is a senior insight lead at Reddit. She's an expert in inclusivity in marketing, media, and tech. She's got a PhD in cultural studies from Duke University, and she's been advising global brands like Nike, Disney, and Samsung, among others. And she just wrote a new book, Cultural Intelligence for Marketers, which is now available on Amazon. Hello, Anastasia. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So this is super exciting topic. And for those who maybe are not quite familiar with the term, can you just define what is cultural intelligence?
That's a great way to begin. And in the book, I actually start with the premise that there's no single definition of what cultural intelligence is that I know in the industry right now, and that we actually need new language and new agreed upon terminology to do this work well. And so that is the purpose of the book and what the book does. And in Cultural Intelligence for Marketers, I define cultural intelligence as the practice of intentionally tracking and seeking to understand signals, signs, patterns, movement, and culture, and using that cultural knowledge to achieve predetermined outcomes, both to drive commercial advantage and influence society for the better.
Right. So there is this concept in marketing that we can see more and more brands try to be inclusive, but what they actually do is what is called performative marketing versus inclusive representations. Can you just explain what's the major difference? Because it's not about just including models of various races and genders and body sizes in our campaigns. It's much more than that. Just can you explain the difference?
Absolutely. That is the premise of the book and really what is the main tension at its core. And that is why, precisely what you just said, why I define cultural intelligence as a practice of seeking to understand culture with more rigor, with more precision, precisely for the reason that you bring up. And that in the last 4 or so years, what we've seen is well-intentioned marketers and brands lean into inclusivity, but do so in a way where we see some incremental change, but really no major shifts in how inclusivity is practiced in the industry. And so we see in some ways greater inclusivity, but we are at a kind of crossroads, as I see it in marketing, where we have stalled in a way by focusing on this superficial kind of inclusivity, where we focus on casting who appears in marketing communications, which is certainly very important. I want to stress that that's still very critical, but that is just the first step. And in the book, I really try to invite the readers to think a little bit more rigorously and critically about what that means in terms of the kind of progress that we're hoping to make and how slow that progress has been, not only in the last 4 years, but to be honest, in the last half a century, since the idea of social responsibility and inclusivity in advertising first kind of breached the surface in the world of marketers. And cultural intelligence really provides an alternative for thinking about culture not only through the lens of surface level inclusivity of who is in the advertising communications that we produce, but what kind of stories do we tell? How do we tell them? What is the messaging that is being put up through the narratives? Because we can imagine a scenario where brand might produce a quote unquote diverse looking ad or a campaign, but the messaging might not necessarily resonate, or it might not land, or in some ways it might still be stereotypical. So cultural intelligence for marketers is a playbook in that sense, which hopefully offers readers a way to think about it, less so as a set of visuals and more so as a skill that marketers need to intentionally think about, work on, develop, and master as part of what it means to be a modern day marketer in this cultural landscape.
Right. So it makes sense. And in your book, while writing the book, you had an opportunity to interview many leaders from firms like Whedon and Kennedy and such. And you've also included a lot of case studies from top brands. Can you give us some of the best examples of that cultural intelligence and maybe not so great examples so we can just understand the concept?
One of my favorite parts of the book is the interviews I conducted. Part of why I did that is to showcase some of the examples that are not always as visible. When we think about inclusive advertising, social responsibility, we often focus on the Nikes and the Patagonias and Ben and Jerry's, like these big examples of brands that are doing inclusivity right and are putting it at the core of their brand. What I'm trying to get us to think about is really centering this idea of social consciousness as integral practice of marketing, no matter what brand does it. In the book, I interviewed the CEO of, well, excuse me, currently no longer the CEO, I believe, but the founder rather of the brand called Billy. And you might be familiar with it. It is a brand that focuses on direct to consumer razor products and adjacent products in that category. And it emerged as one of these new brands that we've never heard before that really found a niche within the category in a way that spoke to what consumers were looking for, but was also very culture forward thinking. It is the first brand, or at least one of the first, that put women's body hair in an advertisement. Speaking in 2024, it is hard to believe that it was so controversial and so disruptive to show women shaving their bodies and using the product as intended. Billy, as a brand, broke into the category with this very bold, strong messaging that saw where the conversation around gender norms and gender inclusivity was headed and what their target consumers were really looking for. And it really alienated some people, but it also drew in their crowd. And in doing so, I think it not only achieved very successful commercial results, but actually had an impact on culture. And I think that's the beauty of that example in the framework that I develop in the book, that brands really do have power to not only drive business, but create that ripple effect in culture where we now, perhaps in 2024, don't think of showing women consumers shaving their bodies and using product as intended as so outrageous as it was, say, in 2014 or 2015. As far as the brands or examples that are perhaps not as helpful, I don't necessarily want to call out a particular brand because part of what I talk in the book is that there are real people like us behind these brands. And a lot of times, what we lack in the industry is cultural literacy and the skills to do better. But I will be happy to describe what I think is less ideal version of inclusivity. And that is precisely what you talked about before, the kind of superficial attempt at appearing to be diverse and inclusive without really being cognizant of how the marketing messaging lands, not only with the target audience, but in the culture more broadly. And that is why, to just give a little bit of preview and as kind of tools that I package into the book, I talk about reception theory, for instance, which is borrowed from cultural studies and specifically a cultural theorist, Stuart Hall, that really invites marketers to think about the journey of how their message travels into culture and how it's going to be received and interpreted by various segments of society, their target audience, but also the public more broadly. And develop these skills to think about that more critically, more intentionally early on, and be able to predict these responses and prepare for them. The failures that we see, as I write in the book, in the marketplace, are brands who did not prepare for how their message was going to be received, quite particularly for some of us who are dedicated to studying culture and how it evolves.
Yeah. Okay, you started talking about your framework, and that was one of my next questions. So that's the four C's, right? Can you just walk us through your framework and how to use it. And maybe you can even give us, I think that the Billy example is a great example. And I encourage you guys to check out their website, mybilly.com. And maybe you have more examples to share with us as well.
Absolutely. I think part of why I wanted to create some kind of tangible, actionable framework is because I talked to a lot of marketers who are well intentioned, really wanting and eager to do more inclusive work, but might have not had the experiences, the skills, or even the time in their careers to devote to that. After all, we have entire disciplines dedicated to these subjects. And so, what the 4Cs framework aims to do is to provide different touch points for brand marketers, researchers, advertisers, creatives, copywriters to really zoom in on different aspects of the process of producing cultural intelligent marketing that is most relevant to them. And so I talk about cultural intelligence through the lens of what I call 4Cs, to borrow the very famous and familiar
Yeah.
framework to marketers that is perhaps less complex or intimidating in acquiring and developing these skills. And I talk about the importance of understanding first culture. So that's the first C. And I devote an entire chapter to each of those, delving deeper into how we might understand culture, not just as a set of traditions or cultural attire or foods that people eat or even rituals that we participate, but a more comprehensive ecosystem that consists of the messaging that we constantly receive from media, and advertising being one of them. So I talk about culture and representation in culture through that lens, not only who is represented, but the kind of messaging that we receive. And through some of the examples from the history of advertising, I attempt to show the way that brands have always been embedded in culture and have always not only reflected culture, but have drawn on culture for inspiration in creative, in ad messaging, so on. And by implication, have had no escape and will never have any escape from being engaged in culture. So the first C is the culture. I talk about communication. I talk about communication through the perspective of the reception theory that I mentioned, which is that as marketers, we need to realize our role not only as the custodians of the brands that we put in the marketplace, that we advertise, that we're responsible for, but also as producers of media. I talk quite at length about how we might benefit from seeing marketing as a form of media in culture, much like entertainment or popular culture. After all, we are responsible for putting mass messaging in front of audiences at scale. And a lot of times, the messaging should at least tap into codes and registers, emotional narratives that resonate with people. So again, we are tied to culture and cultural narratives in how we communicate to our audiences. And so, in that chapter in particular, I encourage marketers to think a little bit more critically and intentionally about how messaging travels, how we might predict how will be received, how we might prepare for how it will land or not land, and for the purpose of avoiding preventable mistakes, essentially. I talk about the third C, which is consciousness. And in another framework, kind of broader framework that I developed for cultural intelligence, I talk about the importance of having these pressure forces almost. I imagine them as pressure forces that should always be pressure testing the work through the perspective of diversity, equity, inclusivity, accountability. In that chapter, I talk about intersectionality and how a lot of times in our profession, we love, for good reason, to simplify and clarify things in messaging, but oftentimes that has resulted in marketers adopting terms like intersectionality without necessarily embodying its true essence. And so I explain what intersectionality is and how one might be a truly intersectional marketer. And lastly, last but not least, the fourth C in the framework is community. Co creation with audiences is so much more important. We see that in the data around audiences and a kind of big brand skepticism that is pervasive. Folks are much more aware of how brands communicate messages, how we sell, how we try to persuade, how we try to move people. And so we see the emergence of community and more horizontal relationship between brands and consumers, creators, communities that brands engage in a way that requires us to be more attentive to questions of accountability, to questions of reciprocity. So, not just extraction from cultural communities, but also contribution to cultural communities in a way that creates true resonance, authentic resonance that really lands. So, those are 4 C's in cultural intelligence framework, and I go through them in quite detail. And not to keep talking, but I guess the last question you asked was about certain other examples. And so they are sprinkled throughout the book. I talk about, for example, Microsoft's campaign for Martin Luther King's Day of last year in 2023, where they partnered with Dr. King Center to produce digitized materials of the life of Coretta Scott King and her contributions after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And it's one of the great examples where when you look at that particular campaign, you can hardly see the Microsoft logo. You have to actually look to find it. And it's not front and center. It's not boasting. It's not trying to sell or advertise or position the brand in a way that feels a little icky, in a way that people really pick up easily. It's an example of a true partnership that I think speaks to that last C of co creation and community as the future of marketing.
Yeah, well said, well said. And I think you made a good point with like we are aware of marketing and advertising these days as consumers. So those brands who do it the right way, as you mentioned, you go in detail in your book about those 4 elements of your framework. There is a lot of information we can find in order to create our marketing strategy the right way. As you mentioned, not having your logo super prominent, doing this more in a subtle way is probably the way to go. And you also mentioned that brands can influence and shape our cultural norms and values, right? And you gave us an example of that. So my last question would be like for those of us creatives or marketers who are listening to this podcast, obviously we're going to link to your book, but other than that, how to start, where to start learning the concept and how to start implementing that in our work.
Fantastic question. That is a one of the most popular questions that I get from marketers, and I think it speaks to the previous point that I made that a lot of marketers just haven't had an opportunity the way that our industry is set up to get that cultural literacy or media literacy training, and I hope that's changing as cultural intelligence as a concept, as a framework is being put on the map for advertisers. What I talk about with a lot of marketers who reach out to me to ask for resources, materials, and also what I talk about in the book is the need, I think, to expand what I call our frame of reference. A lot of times we are not aware the way in which our own environment shapes our perceptions and our assumptions. And so in the book, I devote quite a few sections to topics like how to challenge your own assumptions, how to identify your own bias, how to really question the way that one is thinking about things, the way that one is perceiving things, even the ideas that we come up with, the messages that we think is going to land, how we think about brands. Part of cultural intelligence as a practice, the way I see it, is developing these skills of interrogating oneself, interrogating one's thinking, and developing the practice of asking, what's missing, what's not here, what I might not be noticing. And I think one way that we do that is to expand our point of reference to other types of knowledge that might not be part of the standard business toolkit, so to say, and might not be immediately legible to marketers as relevant to business. I hope to make it clear in the book by drawing so heavily on cultural studies as my area of training before I transitioned into marketing and advertising to show the importance of drawing on concepts, ideas, frameworks, and inspiration from other areas of culture because there's no way for us to really engage culture intelligently if we only think about it through the lens of business, through the lens of brand positioning, through the lens of messaging and targeting, which certainly obviously very important for us to do well commercially. But for us to be able to do really good work that we are proud of in terms of cultural fluency and inclusivity, equity, and accountability, we have to engage with the kind of conversations that exist on the margins of society, the kind of conversations that exist in spaces that we are not familiar with. And so my answer is usually immerse yourself in the kind of conversations that might not feel intuitive for you to engage in as a marketer. And I say that because when in 2020, brands were hit with this demand for accountability, outspokenness, commentary, it was not surprising, for example, to someone like me who has been engaged in activist conversation on the periphery of society for the previous 5 to 7 years. These ideas were coming and being pushed into the mainstream. And what happened in 2020 is that a lot of us were just caught off guard and didn't know how to handle it because we were never exposed to it. Where the culture is headed is always starting at the periphery, and the ideas that are going to shape culture start at the periphery, start in subcultures, and are being pushed into the mainstream. They might be rejected, they might be adopted in some way, but they will eventually be part of what it means to be a modern day marketer. And we saw that with questions of inclusivity and diversity. I predict that's only going to intensify as Gen Z and Gen Alpha are going to become the primary consumer market for the industry. So, all that is to say, immerse yourself in a conversation that you would otherwise not find relevant to marketing. That's my best advice on where to get started.
Yeah, that's a great tip for you guys who want to learn more. For marketing, branding experts, we need to stay open to those concepts. I recommend you check out Anastasia's book so that you can reflect on your own creative thinking and question your ideas so that you can come up with better ideas, more relevant ideas, and create better campaigns. We're going to link to your book. And for those who just want to connect with you, maybe ask you some questions, what's the best way to get in touch?
Absolutely. I would love to hear from folks who listen to this, who have further questions. I am best reached on my LinkedIn. I have a small but mighty following there and a really close knit community of thinkers from across marketing and advertising, as well as adjacent diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces. I run a kind of small online community through my content there. My DMs are open, so I'm very eager to hear any reflections, any provocations, any pushbacks that might be hopefully generated by this conversation.
We're going to link to your LinkedIn so you guys can connect with Anastasia and check out her book. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much.